Well, hello again. I remain Mr. Laskowski, your faithful history teacher, and somehow still the host of this award-eligible series of instructional videos called AP United States History and You. When we last left our heroes, the United States had just won the Mexican War, and unlike the War for Texas independence, we actually brought the receipts. That is to say, we negotiated a treaty to end the war. And what a treaty it was. As you might recall, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo recognized California's independence and handed pretty much the entire Southwest over to the United States, all for the low, low price of about $18 million. Of course, getting all that big, beautiful land not only made expansionists and map makers happy, it also led somehow to this. This neighborhood of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In 1847, in the middle of the Mexican War, a new tract of land opened up for development, and soon a collection of beautiful row houses were built along streets named after the battles and generals of the Mexican War: Monterrey, Palo Alto, Buena Vista, Fremont, and even old Rough and Ready himself, General Taylor. Of course, by this time, by the time all of the houses were finally built, well, General Taylor had become President Taylor, and then 18 months, 16 months actually later, President Taylor would become dead. Not because of the curse of Tecumseh, but because apparently history really hates generals who join the Whig Party and then run for president. First Harrison, and now Taylor. It's dangerous to be a Whig general president, or a general president Whig, or generally a president with a wig. Pause for groans or pity laughter. Okay, the next thing we need to talk about, though, is the Compromise of 1850. But to get there, we have to first talk about California and the California Gold Rush. In 1848, just as California was getting its independence from Mexico, gold was discovered in them thar hills of Northern California. The promise of new land and of untold riches contributed to a huge gold rush as people rushed across the country in 1849, which explains why the San Francisco football team is called the 49ers and why they wear gold helmets. Of course, most prospectors never did get rich or anything close to it, but they stayed, and California has been luring migrants and immigrants ever since. And here's something that James K. Polk said as if to further the rush of people. The accounts of abundance in gold in that territory are so extraordinary, it would scarcely command belief were they not corroborated by authentic reports of officers in the public service. So, in other words, go west if you want to get rich, and people did. They'd get on steamships, they'd go all the way around the southern tip of South America, they'd figure out a way to get to California. Some would go across the mountain range. And so a real question became, how do you get to California? Not just do you get to California, but how do you do it? So the gold rush led to some serious questions about California and the land between here and California. The population boom led to the crisis the very next year in 1850 when California applied for statehood, and this made the issue of statehood in California, slavery, and the settlement of the West, it put it right there at the feet of Congress. And Congress found that it had not one, not two, not three, not four, but five different issues to resolve. And surprisingly, Northerners and Southerners, they had radically different views on all five. California applied for statehood with a constitution that outlawed slavery. So, would we let it be free? Well, Northerners certainly hoped so, but Southern politicians argued that the Missouri Compromise line should be extended through California, and it should be dividing California up into two states, one that allowed slavery, one that forbid it. Regarding the settlement of the Western territories, Northerners wanted all of that land to be free soil, and Southerners, not surprisingly, wanted to be open to slavery, or at the very least, where popular sovereignty could decide the issue. And this mattered because with so many people headed to California, it was only a matter of time before we'd want to build a transcontinental railroad to get ourselves there. And invariably, some people would get as far as, I don't know, Arizona and think, I think I'll settle down right here. But could they bring enslaved people with them to settle in Arizona? That is a very good question, and one that Congress would need to answer. Well, both sides recognized that Texas was way, way, way too big, but they disagreed on how they should split it. Northerners wanted to chop it down and prohibit slavery in the territories that got cut out. Southerners, predictably, wanted slavery to be allowed in the carved out territories. And something that really irritated Northerners and frankly diplomats from foreign countries was the fact that human beings were being bought and sold inside the District of Columbia, just steps away from the United States Capitol, where freedom and democracy were being celebrated. Enslaved people were being bought and sold, traded in public markets. Northerners wanted it stopped. Southerners saw no problem with it at all. But finally, the issue of what to do with runaway enslaved people, that was really something that was really irritating Southerners. For decades, by law, states that prohibited slavery could not interfere with slave catchers or do anything to protect or harbor escaped enslaved people. But in recent years, many northern states had started interfering with the slave catchers and even passing something called personal liberty laws, which allowed people to not enforce fugitive slave laws if it violated their personal beliefs. So what would we do about all these fugitive slave laws? Northerners claimed states' rights and said that states should be able to do whatever they want, regardless of what Congress or the national government said. And just as hypocritically, Southern states, the ones who had threatened nullification and secession over a state's right to refuse tariffs, they suddenly favored national supremacy, saying, you can't just defy a national law because you don't like it. That would be a confederacy. Pause for ironic laughter. Well, because there were so many different issues to resolve, perhaps it makes sense that all of the old guard political leaders would want to have one last shot, one last debate, even though they were all ancient and near death. Calhoun was there to argue the Southern side of the issue, and Daniel Webster was there to stand up for the Northern side. And Henry Clay, the great compromiser, the great pacifier, he knew what the country needed. One last compromise to save the Union. And in the end, that's exactly what happened. With 5 different issues to resolve, a good compromise would be if 2 got for one side and 2 got the other side, and then maybe we tied on the 5th issue. So 2 for one, 2 for the other, and then a tie. And that is exactly how it turned out. California, as it happened, would join the Union as a free state. That's a win for the northern states. No restrictions were made, however, in the southwestern territories with regard to slavery. And that's what we call de facto popular sovereignty, which means because we didn't explicitly restrict the spread of slavery into those territories, essentially what we were doing was allowing people to bring their enslaved people there and then make up their own minds about it. So here we are, each side, one win. Texas totally got chopped down, but Congress also gave it $10 million for the honor. And no mention was made about slavery in the areas that got chopped out of Texas, which meant that, just like the ones in the Southwest Territory, that's de facto popular sovereignty as well. Usually we tend to think of the Texas deal as a tie, but the extra money and the fact that slavery wasn't forbidden in the territories means that it was probably more beneficial to the South. As for the slave trade in DC, it totally got abolished, which was a win for Northerners. But in exchange for that, Congress passed a newer and stricter fugitive slave law, one that rigged the system. It rigged the system in favor of the slave catchers. Here's how. If a slave catcher found a person he thought was an escaped enslaved person, he needed to go to a judge and get court approval to take the fugitive away. Otherwise, it would be kidnapping. Well, judges who didn't like slavery, they often refused to allow slave catchers to be taken by the fugitive, taken as fugitives back to the South. So these new fugitive slave laws encouraged judges to reconsider that, and here is how. Each time a judge ruled on a fugitive slave case, he got paid. They got paid by the case. If the judge refused to allow the slave catcher to take the enslaved person back, the fugitive back, if he said, no, you can't take him back, the judge will be paid $5 each time. However, if the judge granted the slave catcher's request, the judge would be paid $10 each time. It was in each judge's financial interest, their self-interest, to grant these requests because they would make twice as much money if they said, take the enslaved person back south, than if they said, no, you can't do that. So much for equal justice under the law. But for all its faults, the Compromise of 1850 was pretty fair, and both Northerners and Southerners felt pretty good about the result. More importantly, the Compromise of 1850 settled forever the issue of slavery in the Western Territories, so we never ever had to talk about the issue of slavery ever again, asterisk. Of course we would. In fact, the Compromise of 1850 is often thought of as only a temporary solution, one that perhaps postponed the start date of the Civil War, but couldn't settle the underlying problems that were ripping the country apart. So before we go on talking about precisely how the country split apart, let's take a minute to think about why. In short, the country couldn't come to any kind of agreement about the most fundamental questions about that a society has to answer, like these ones I've listed here. Who is a citizen? Who is an American? And what does liberty and equality mean in a country where millions of people are held in slavery? Native Americans are driven off their ancestral lands, and 0 women have the right to vote. So what rights do citizens have, or what rights do any people have? And in this land of immigrants, we open our doors to some newcomers and then slam the door shut on others. So who is welcome in our country? And looking at these questions, sadly, today, even today, right, our answer to these questions is, well, it's more complicated than you would think. And in 1850, the answers centered around one key issue: slavery, which meant, of course, no one agreed on anything. Well, all of those disagreements not only occurred between political parties, but within the parties themselves. Case in point, Whigs realized that the only way to win an election was to avoid taking any meaningful position on slavery at all, which worked in 1848, but it was really irritating to anti-slavery Whigs like Daniel Webster and a young Abraham Lincoln. And this is why a faction of the party calling itself the Conscience Whigs emerged. They believed that in all the things that the other Whigs did about bigger government, etc., but they opposed the expansion of slavery into the new Western territories, Conscience Whigs. Democrats were similarly disunited. In 1848, they had opted for a popular sovereignty position on slavery, but that irritated many Southern Democrats who wanted slavery protected and allowed to expand everywhere, north, east, south, and especially west. But another faction of anti-slavery Democrats, nicknamed the Barn Burners, thought that popular sovereignty was too permissive, and they wanted slavery banned in all of the Western territories. But wait, there's more. Now, considering that Barn Burners and Conscience Whigs both opposed the expansion of slavery, you might think that they should just combine and form their own third party, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. In truth, there already was a third party, one that opposed the expansion of slavery and called itself the Liberty Party. The reason you've never heard of it is because it failed spectacularly in the elections of 1840 and 44. Then, in the wake of the Mexican War and the addition of all that land in the Southwest, the party was rebranded as the Free Soil Party. It was this party that attracted the Barn Burners and the Conscience Whigs, siphoning votes away from the Democrats and the Whigs in 1848 and in 1852, but it still wasn't enough. However, between 1852 and 1856, something truly amazing happened to change the world forever. And it happened in this little tiny house in Ripon, Wisconsin, where a group of Free Soilers realized that they would never appeal to the whole nation with a name like the Free Soil Party. And so they dusted off the old word Republican, rebranded themselves one last time, and announced the presence of the Republican Party in 1854 in Ripon, Wisconsin. And so every Republican president that we've ever had, from Lincoln to Teddy Roosevelt to Eisenhower to Reagan and beyond, all of them belong to the party that started in this little white schoolhouse in Ripon, Wisconsin. You should visit it. It's pretty cool. But remember, one of our questions that we asked was, who is welcome in our country? And a large faction of Americans answered, no more foreign immigrants. The idea that a nation that in 1850 had only 23 million people was totally already full might sound ridiculous to us now in our country of 330 million, but remember, immigration policy is rarely about how many people are coming to the country and more about where they're coming from. In the 1790s, the Federalists feared immigration by the French, and so we got the Alien and Sedition Acts. In 1882, Congress barred all immigration from China, and in 1924, after waves of huddled masses yearning to breathe free came to America from such dangerous places as Italy and the Ukraine, and in the case of my grandparents, Poland, Congress all but closed the door to almost all immigrants. In the 1840s, though, the main waves of immigrants were coming from Catholic enclaves in Germany, and then following the potato famine, which struck Ireland particularly hard, people coming from Ireland. And so as boatloads of German and Irish immigrants, Catholics I should mention, started arriving in the United States, that old native hostility toward Catholics, dating all the way back to the Pilgrims and to the Puritans, returned with a vengeance. Now you might ask, wait, isn't everyone guaranteed freedom of religion by the First Amendment? Well, yes, earnest student, they are, but remember, that only applies to citizens, not who we decide to let in the country or not. And so it was out of fear or bigotry or, just not practicing the lead from here competency of being culturally inclusive, nativists formed an anti-immigrant third party, first called the Know Nothings because they started off as a super secret society, and then they called themselves the American Party, which was pretty simplistic, and eventually they rebranded themselves as the Native American Party, which probably confused actual Native Americans, but it was the name that declared we are the true Native Americans here because our families came to the US, 20 or 30 years ago. And it's these new immigrants coming on the new boats here that are ruining our country. And here you see another kind of disturbing American tradition, blaming immigrants and refugees for all of our country's problems. It's an intellectually lazy, usually racist form of scapegoating, but it is also nothing new, and that can be pretty depressing. And while all of this stuff about the different parties and the breakdown is really fascinating, you might ask yourself, wouldn't it be great if this could be shown in some kind of cool graphic form? I totally agree. Now, this is a cool chart that I found in a book from 1880 called The Conspectus of the History of Political Parties. And it shows all the interweaving connections between parties and factions and splinter groups. But maybe you'd prefer something a little more straightforward, and so I offer this. For the visual learners in the audience, it shows how the two-party system breaks down in the antebellum period to the end that by 1860, the Whigs were dead, the Native Americans were gone, the Democrats would eventually split in half. Why? Any guesses? Any guesses? Anyone? That's right, the issue of slavery. That's what led to this whole dismantling of our two-party system. But wait, didn't the Compromise of 1850 solve forever the issue of slavery? Asterisk? Well, yes, it did, but let's remember what that asterisk meant. The asterisk means forever, in this particular case, means no more than 10 years. And so our solution in 1850 had a shelf life that would last it right up until 1860. So before we rip the country apart, let's take our mind off of things here with a couple of diversions. Which is kind of like when you put off reading your history textbook by rearranging your sock drawer or taking 18 online quizzes like which Pokemon are you or what's your spirit animal. For the United States, the issue was how to get to California as quickly as possible. The obvious answer was to build a transcontinental railroad, and that surely would be one of the important issues facing Congress. But there was something else that could be done maybe faster without having to build a 3,000-mile train line? Maybe that would be cheaper than sailing all the way down around the tip of South America and then sailing all the way back up the Pacific coast to get to California. Like, I don't know, think about Panama. We're at the thinnest part of Central America, where the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans are separated by a narrow isthmus of about 50 miles. Couldn't we just build a canal there? Well, we built a canal across New York, so why couldn't we build one across Panama? Well, yes, theoretically we could do this, but two things stood in our way. First, Panama, if you didn't notice, is foreign territory, so you can't just show up there with our shovels. And second, Great Britain also had an interest in building a canal, so it could get to its colonies in India and Australia and Hong Kong faster. And naturally, we did not want to have a conflict with our besties, and so we did what we always seem to do in a situation like this. We made a treaty. So go ahead and add this to your list of treaties. The Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, signed in 1850, in which the United States and Great Britain agreed that someday, whenever we got around to it, and wherever we decided to build the canal, either in Panama or next door in Nicaragua, that we would agree to jointly occupy the so-called Canal Zone. In other words, let's not fight. And also, while we're at it, let's not ask the Panamanians or Nicaraguans what they think about this. So it's kind of sweet, and also kind of racist at the same time. At last, let's talk about one last distraction before we get back to slavery, and it's our favorite one, Cuba. As you might remember, Cuba, our true love, our heart's desire, the one who is so close to us, but still somehow just out of our reach, well, Cuba was one of the few Spanish colonies that never got independence when the rest of Latin America did. And with good reason. The sugarcane plantations on Cuba made so much money for the mother country that it was easily one of the single most lucrative European colonies in the world. And there it was, just 90 miles away from Key West, ripe for the picking, if only we could figure out how. Well, in 1854, in Ostend, Belgium, a group of American ambassadors, including former Secretary of State and future terrible President James Buchanan, met to make a secret diabolical plan. And it went like this. The United States would offer Spain $130 million to purchase Cuba from Spain. Wait, what? $130 million? We only spent $15 million for the entire Louisiana purchase and another $18 million for the entire Mexican cession. And now we're offering $130 million just for Cuba? Yes. Yes, it's that important to us. And as James Buchanan himself put it, a little desperately, we must have Cuba. We cannot do without Cuba. But folks, here is the secret diabolical part. If the Spanish don't agree to sell, the United States could just, invade and conquer Cuba and just take it for ourselves. So remember, the key to having a secret diabolical plan be successful, you have to keep it a secret. And the fact that we're talking about it here now suggests that you already know what happened. The secret got out, and once it did, any chance that the Spanish might sell Cuba, it went up in smoke. And worse, other nations, even Great Britain, let us know that they were definitely not okay with any plan that involved our invading Cuba. And so we had to give up on the dream, at least for another 40 years. So close, but seemingly forever, just so far away. Okay, well, we have put off the issue of slavery for long enough, and it's time to address what I like to call the four horsemen of the American apocalypse. But that is the subject of another presentation. So for now, I'll just sign off saying thank you for watching. I hope you took great notes, and I will see you on the